It's a real privilege to have Professor Kevin Clements speaking with us today. He's been around a long time in the field of peace and non-violence. He opened or founded a centre for the study of peace and conflict in Australia, and has done the same in New Zealand. And there are lots of people studying at the Centre for Peace Studies in Otago University. And all of this makes a difference in our world. This year, 2014, everybody's talking about war because it's the centenary of the first great European war, or not the first, one of many European wars, and one at which many of our people went to fight and many to die. And while we recognise and value and honour them, we want to keep on pushing for other ways to deal with conflict. Today, Kevin has been engaged in a multinational phone meeting from 11 till 12 because he's so involved in actually doing the conflict resolution. We are privileged to have you here today, Kevin. Thank you.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa, and thank you all for coming out and giving up your lunchtime and sacrificing some material well-being for hopefully some intellectual stimulation. Before I begin, I'd just like to say thank you to all of the people who've made this possible in the Trust. I'd like to also acknowledge people like John Murray and others who've served this place and turned it into a site for frank and free discussions around peace and justice and all the kind of big challenges that face us in our everyday lives. So even though I can't do it in Te Reo, I'd like to thank you all and all the ancestors of this place for the work they've done in ensuring that it becomes a space in which catalytic and transformative things might happen. I wrote a text, but I'm going to abandon the text. It's too boring. And just sort of focus on a couple of things. We've just come through Easter and Anzac Day, and some of our worst anxieties about Anzac Day are coming to fruition, and some of our best hopes for Anzac Day are also coming to fruition. It's not a complete orgy of nationalism and hypermasculinity and a celebration of militarism and the heroic journeying. There are alternative voices being raised, and it's those I want to build on. Similarly, having just come through Easter, it's not just a sort of a celebration of personal salvation. It's also, I think, a reminder to all of us that before the redemption, there has to be something to do with suffering. What are the crosses we might wish to bear as we think about where we stand in the world and what we want to do with our lives in it? And so, for me, there are two big challenges facing Aotearoa New Zealand and the globe in the 21st century. The first challenge is, how do we relate to nature in a way which is more respectful and likely to be more sustainable over the next 100 years? Because if we don't get that right, nothing of what I have to say will have any significance whatsoever. I don't have any time to talk about climate change and so forth, but it's a challenge. You just have to think about the weird weather patterns of the last summer, at least in Dunedin, to understand that this is not normal times. And that, I think, is something that we have to take on board. And the second biggest challenge as we approach 9 billion people by 2030 is, how are we going to live with each other, both personally and in terms of the large groups and tribes that we're a part of, and in terms of our nationalities. They're linked. How we deal with nature and how we deal with ourselves are inextricably linked. And whether we do this, whether we treat nature non-violently and whether we treat each other non-violently, is at the heart of what it is to be human. So that's by way of preamble. That's had nothing to do with the text. What I want to do is kind of focus on that issue of how we deal with each other and make an argument for non-violence, make an argument for non-violent political and social movements, and make an argument for non-violence becoming the absolute norm in the 21st century for whatever we might want to do in terms of political and social transformation. And then talk a little bit about some of the ways in which we can be non-violent with each other and the way in which we can kind of agitate for more non-violent transformation politically. It was Gandhi who understood something important about political struggle, that it's always in the last instance a struggle within the self. The real clash of civilizations is not out there between Admiral Westerners and Muslim zealots. It's here within each person as we oscillate uneasily between self-protective aggression and the ability to live in the world with others. So this talk is going to oscillate between thinking about peace at multiple levels. The personal, are we at peace with ourselves? Or do we wrap ourselves with self-protective anger and aggression? How do we manifest our care and concern for others at the interpersonal level and get those relationships right? It's extraordinarily challenging. I would think even at my ripe young age of 67, I would like to think that, I have my personal relationships right. But, there are a lot of challenges about personal relationships. How do you get them right through life? And how do we keep on, pursuing them in ways which, and engaging with others in ways which are going to liberate self and other together? And how do we do this at the intergroup, international and transnational levels? It was Seaman Vale who said, attention is the purest form of generosity. And Michael Main says, part of being human is to experience moments of true perception about those things that touch you so intimately that suddenly you see. What you see or read or hear at such moments has a ring of truth about it, not just of a general kind, but as something that takes on a dimension and depth of you so that it becomes your truth. It seems to be making a claim on you. Such moments don't come often. Hold on to them. Cherish them until they become so much a part of you as to be second nature. For there is only one persistent demand made upon us by the Spirit. It is that we are receptive, that we keep our minds open, our minds unclosed. It is, in short, that we retain in all our lives our sense of wonder. So I want to start with that because it seems to me that we can't be non-violent unless we're open to non-violent possibility in all of its manifest forms. And we can't be non-violent with others unless we attend to others with the seriousness that others demand and which we would expect them to treat us. And so this, I think, is the kind of biggest challenge of all. How do we, in this frenetic world where, my wife gets extraordinarily agitated if I have the iPad at midnight doing an email instead of focusing on her, how do we, in this frenetic world, create the space for attention? Attention to self, attention to others, attention to all of those diverse groups that make up the world as we know it. And how do we do this so that we're not only open to possibility, but we have the time and the space to become imaginative about how we wish to pursue our lives in relation to others and in relation to nature? And just some kind of general thoughts on non-violence and violence. Bettelheim said, violence is the behavior of someone incapable of imagining other solutions to the problem at hand. Gandhi said he opposed all violence because the good it does is always temporary, but the harm it does is permanent. Malcolm X, who kind of moved from non-violence to violence, says non-violence is fine as long as it works. Gandhi said non-violence is a weapon of the strong. And Joan Baez, who I was deadly in love with at the age of 15 or 16, said non-violence is a flop. The only bigger flop is violence. So the challenge that's confronting us is, and this is the human challenge, is how do we ensure our well-being in the company of others? I mean, this has been the eternal challenge facing philosophers and people of religious persuasion throughout history. How do we live, breathe, move, and have our being in the company of others who also have rights to live, move, and have their being? How do we do this in ways which enable us to respect and honor the other, even when that other is creating stresses and strains for us, or we're in grave disagreement with that other? How do we honor the other when the other is causing suffering and we need to stop that suffering? I mean, all of these are the challenges which I'm sure Richard must have raised on Tuesday, and which people in this audience have raised with you, I'm sure, over the years. And there are two big pivots here, and I want to kind of just sort of alert you to where I'm going to go here. There's a big pivot between what I call principled nonviolence. That's nonviolence which is based on some ethical and religious impulse or humanitarian impulse, which is radical and rigorous in its attention to how we are nonviolence, and what is becoming known as strategic nonviolence, pragmatic nonviolence, a nonviolence which is sort of a tool in your repertoire of social skills, which you can bring out when you need to, and which you exhaust, but which still retains the possibility of a violent response if non-violence doesn't work. And so some of what I'm going to talk about has to do with the difference between principled and non-principled non-violence. And the reason I'm doing this is because some of the hopeful signs for non-violence of 2012, 2013, in terms of the Arab Spring and so forth, are proving not to be as springy as we thought they were going to be. And one of the reasons why they're not is because the movement actors applied pragmatic or strategic nonviolence to those transformations and not principled nonviolence. So I'm just kind of being upfront with you here. I'm making a plug for principled nonviolence, of nonviolence which is embedded in ethical principles and religious principles, in principles which are aimed at enshrining nonviolence as a way of life. And I think that's at the heart of where we want to be. I should just mention, incidentally, that we've had a wonderful person staying with us at the Target Center for Peace and Conflict Studies, Ed Garcia from the Philippines, and one of his nice contributions to our center was he said, why don't we declare Castle Street, I don't know whether you know Castle Street, those who know Dunedin know Castle Street, as a zone of peace. We're right beside Selwyn College, which is at midnight on a Saturday night is far from peaceful. And we have the Maori Studies Centre and the Maori Development Centre and CSAFE and Selwyn College and Dundas Street nearby. And so anyway, just to let you know, this is taking on as an idea, and instead of just a nuclear-free zone, we're beginning to conceptualize for Castle Street, all of the people in it, and we've had conversation with Selwyn College, what it means to be a zone of peace. What does that mean in terms of interpersonal relationships, community relationships, sustainability? And so, just to let you know from the south right now, we're going to take over New Zealand street by street for zones of peace. Okay, so what are some caveats? I want to say that strategic and pragmatic non-violent movements are definitely better than violent political social movements, and are preferable to opportunistic and ad hoc non-violent movements. But I don't believe that either strategic non-violent or violent movements are going to generate stable peace and justice, however, without being embedded in some principled framework. And I think that's where religions and philosophers and people concerned about ethics and morality have a role to play. So that's why I'm in favor of principled non-violent movements promoting social and political change. I mean, one of the things which I kind of find appalling about politics at the moment is that Most politics lacks principle. It's all based on kind of technocratic ad hoc solutions to kind of current problems, rather than presenting any clear direction about where we want to go with ourselves or with society as a whole. And so I'm really kind of issuing a sort of a call for us to think about what principled non-violence would mean in terms of the transformation of New Zealand, street by street, neighbourhood by neighbourhood, community by community, city by city, until we can begin thinking about how do we create a non-violent community which is inclusive, which is just, which is participatory, where we all have a place, where we all can breathe, and where we can all realise our own potentialities. Okay. The rationale for strategic non-violence is that it has low and relative painless entry requirements for movement members. It delinks moral values and means-ends relationships. The proponents of it say you don't need to have a principled framework or ethical commitment to be non-violent. You can just apply non-violent tactics and change will happen. It's proven effective, and I'm going to show you how effective it has been. But the people who adopt what might be called strategic non-violence often view principled non-violent advocates as idealistic and too extreme and too demanding and making claims on people's lives and behaviour which most of us can't cope with, which brings us back to Easter, because if you're unwilling to take up some kind of a cross, then principled non-violence is not for you. If you are interested in taking up some cross, to use the Christian lingo, then principled non-violence is for you, because you can't do it without being non-violent, without being willing to absorb some degree of suffering. And so I can see from our Buddhist friends here as well that this whole business of how do we engage in life so that we embrace death, we embrace the possibility of our own suffering, and do that in transformative ways. I mean, I think that's at the heart of what I'm talking about here. Okay, some people think of strategic non-violence as non-violence light, although it's clearly very dangerous, as is evidenced right now in Egypt. The people that were non-violent advocates, even though they fell into the same traps as Mubarak, are now hundreds of them being convicted and charged and given capital punishment for their resistance. Okay, so the claim is from those who rely more on violent and coercive solutions to life's problems is that non-violent resistance is no good against powerful, repressive or authoritarian regimes. Non-violent resistance is ineffective for achieving difficult demands like the removal of a dictator or territorial change. Non-violence doesn't always work, but it works better than violence doesn't always work, but it works better than non-violence. I mean, they're the sort of common claims. And two people that have been doing good work on this in America right now, Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stefan, and they've showed very clearly that these common claims about what I call strategic non-violence are quite wrong. And indeed, they've proven to be the most effective movements against repressive regimes. If you look at the success rate of non-violent and violent campaigns from 1900 to 2006, if you look at the non-violent campaigns, 50%, over 51% have been successful, and the violent campaigns have been 20% successful in terms of resisting authoritarian regimes. This is around regime change and political transformation. Partial success, that is, the claims have been made, but all the goals of the movement haven't been realized, somewhere between 20 and 10%. But the catastrophic failures and the campaigns which have resulted in persistent war have been the violent campaigns. So despite my caveats about non-violent resistance, the evidence shows very clearly that non-violent political and social transformation has proven over the last 100 years to be much more effective in resisting oppression and in regime transformation than have the violent social movements. And you only have to think of the Velvet Revolutions and the Orange Revolutions and the Carnation Revolutions and so forth. And you can see this by decade as well. From 2000 to 2006, the nonviolent movements have shot ahead. And even in the 1970s and so forth, they were much more important. And we can talk about these later. And then what is also interesting here is that if you're looking at kind of this is a graph showing how movements, these movements are successful because they've been able to generate large-scale mobilization of large numbers of people. Our anti-nuclear movement was highly successful because 82% of the population in the end wanted New Zealand to be nuclear free. These regime changes become most effective when the entire population withdraws its support and its cooperation with the authorities and says, no more, enough. And so this shows you the probability of success as you expand the numbers of people behind the movement. So when I'm talking about social and political transformation, I'm oscillating between what we do as an individual, what we do as groups, and what we do as movements. The reality is that the movements remain absolutely important in terms of political transformation. Peter Dunne and the government didn't move on legal highs because they thought it was a good thing to move on them. They moved on them because city councils and people got agitated. And so one of the challenges, I think, as we think about social and political movements into the 21st century really has to do with how do we create this space for more movement activity? Because without that movement activity, our politicians are going to go on and persist in doing whatever they want to do. So I still remain an old 60s advocate here in terms of thinking through the ways in which the personal does become political, even if I'm very skeptical about the political. Now, what happens then with these movements in terms of violent resistance is that they become even more popular and they arouse more discontent. So if you look at the effects of repression, non-violent campaigns have a 46% success rate against repressive opponents compared with only 20% for violent campaigns. And there are some reasons for this. And this is why the suffering motif comes in as well. When state systems and militaries realize that they have populations who are fearless in the face of danger, as happened in the Philippines with people power and so forth, when they realize that people are willing to stand up against guns and tanks and cannons and are willing to die for their cause, they become very, very, very popular and capable of mobilizing larger and larger numbers of people. And the reasons why is that repression is more likely to backfire. This is known as the backfire phenomenon. So a willingness to suffer for your cause is a very important source of political power and effectiveness. The second reason is that repression itself is unsustainable. There's a limit to how long you can keep shooting the population without losing all legitimacy. So these movements have proven to be extraordinarily effective in transformation change. And so there are 6 essential tasks of nonviolent movements. And I'm going to put down the strategic ones first and then look at the principle. One is that these movements can develop an alternative vision of the future with widespread appeal. And that, I think, is what's lacking in New Zealand politics at the moment. We don't have an alternative vision of the future. We're living on our anti-nuclear laurels. We haven't joined the Marshall Islands in the case to the World Court. We have lots of nuclear-free zone communities, but what do they mean nowadays? Which is why we might want to think in terms of reviving some notion of a zone of peace. How do we maximize diverse participation in non-violent social and political transformative movements? How do we provoke defections? I mean, just to let you know, one of the things that happened before I came in today was I got a note from a cadet at West Point who said he'd looked around the world and was looking for programs that he might do his master's in, and came along our website and wondered whether he could come and do a master's here. Well, this is great. I mean, I've written back immediately and said, sure, come on down. I mean, if we can get some West Point graduates capitulating by provoking defections, we're on the way. We need to figure out ways in which you can minimize the risks of repression in adverse environments. And then we have to think about how do we concentrate and disperse our resources and how do we wage multi-year campaigns? So the challenge with strategic nonviolence, however, is that very often it becomes collusive with power. And I want to sort of suggest that there's a need for us to be very wary of power. There's a nice quote I have here from Max Weber, if I can find it. Max Weber, from those who did sociology will know he in his Politics of Vocation says, the decisive means for politics is violence. Against the prominent German pacifist and Great War opponent Forster, he claimed, it's not true that good can follow only from good and evil only from evil, but that often the opposite is true. Anyone who fails to see this is indeed a political infant. Anyone interested in saving their soul shouldn't seek it along the avenue of politics, for the quite different task of politics can only be solved by violence. In response to the biblical injunction to turn the other cheek, Weber argues, for the politician, the reverse proposition holds, thou shalt resist evil by force. So one of the things which I think, the reason why I'm making a case for principled nonviolence is I think that it's very easy for those who advocate strategic nonviolence to fall into the trap of simply doing politics by other means, but once they achieve power, they find themselves distracted. They have no rudder, no central direction, no goals or aspirations. It's what you might call moderate Machiavellianism. But Bharadwaj, an Indian writer on these issues, says as long as nonviolence is embraced on pragmatic grounds, it prepares itself for self-defeat. And that's because it doesn't link this unity and the integrality of ends and means. And I think that's something that we need to kind of focus more attention on. I've got a whole lot of material here which has to do with the difference between principled and strategic nonviolence. But basically, I mean, the kind of key questions are what is right rather than what will work. Nonviolent means are an end in themselves. It's means-oriented. We need to work out how do we become nonviolent in all that we do and in relation to all that we connect with. Whether they're, people of color, people of different sexual orientation, people of different political persuasion. How do we establish those kinds of dignities? It focuses on root problems rather than specific problems. It's an expression, and it's based on compassion and sacrifice and love of enemies. And that I think is a very different orientation than a calculation of practitioners just being stubborn to your enemies, although that's important as well. So it's much better to go down to Howard Clark's an old friend of ours who just died a couple of years ago, which is really sad. But he developed these principled nonviolent principles. And they're the ones which I want to sort of leave you with. Because I think that they also have to do with the way we do politics. How do you acknowledge the value of each person in your political stance and in your relationship with them? How do you recognize that we all have part of the truth? So that so Gandhi for a long time was talking about non-violence and truth-telling as essentially the same thing. And I think there's a sort of a huge amount of wisdom in this notion. How do we make sure that our actions emphasize openness to promote communication and democratic processes, so that all that we do doesn't divide us from the others, but opens communication to the others, so that even with the worst possible oppressor, how do you open up a conversation with that person is the challenge. I encountered this in Burundi and elsewhere. I had to go, when I was setting up International Alert, and shake hands with a person I knew had been responsible for putting 25 Tutsi into a schoolroom and torching it. It's a very kind of challenging thing to do. But if I hadn't opened up a conversation with them, that person wouldn't have allowed us to go on and do some other wider peace-building work. So how do you do this? How do you make sure that our actions are open to the promotion of communication and we attend to them? How do we ensure that our means and our behaviors and actions are consistent with our ends of affirming life, opposing oppression, and seeking justice? And how do we reinforce the fact that we're willing to undergo suffering rather than inflict it? I mean, that's the biggest challenge of all. This is the cross bit of it. And this bit, but once you've engaged that, then that becomes the most liberating bit of it, because nothing can hurt you. And you have a fearlessness which is critical to doing essential peace building. And the whole point of War Resistance International, from which this comes, is you commit yourselves to non-violent action, according to guidelines agreed. So principle of nonviolence, I think, is much more radical than strategic nonviolence. It's power with others versus power over others. It's a radical challenge to militarize, dominatory, sovereign assertions of nation states and nationalism. That's why it stands in tension with the centennial celebration of Anzac Day. It seeks decentered, decentralized, responsive governance processes and institutions. And it looks for truth in relationships, living each day with truth, justice, patience, compassion, courage, and kindness as companions. I mean, so how many of us do this? I mean, how many of us look for the truth in relationships? How do we seek justice in the relationship with our partners? How do we do this patiently? How do we exercise compassion? How do we do this courageously when, you know, our own selves and our own ego needs seem to dominate everything else? Of course, they can be combined, but I think they have an important role to play as they are. And in my eternal youth, I'm rediscovering Gandhi, and gets back to the first two questions I posed. I mean, when Gandhi talked about Savadaya, he was talking about how do we do justice for all creatures and all nature. So how do we reawaken that interest in and attention to the natural world in ways which will enable us to treat it and see its truth and its wonder and everything else. I mean, this is relatively easy for us to do in New Zealand because we have nature, but it's also being taken from us. Then the Swaraj piece of it is, how do we get on top of ourselves? How do we control all of those kind of dynamics that propel us in different directions, many of which we understand, a lot of which we haven't got any clues about where they came from. Why do we do different things? Why do we engage in repetitive patterns of behavior which are always the same? Negative behaviors. And then Swadeshi is the genius of the local. Why not start building peace in New Zealand from Castle Street, Dunedin? An improbable place, but you know, stranger things have happened. You could also do it from, you know, Wadestown or Tiara or wherever you might be. So where you are is the place of transformative possibility. And the whole point of the non-violent revolution is that there are wrongs to die for, but not a single one to kill for. And once you make that statement, then all kinds of things become pathologies. You know, a lot of our media is oriented towards Thanatos rather than Eros. It's aimed at, you know, creating passive audience. It's aimed at generating passive citizens. It's aimed at narcotizing us through television and through entertainment and bread and circuses. You know, whereas the non-violent, you know, a willingness to embrace non-violence opens us to possibility, forces us to attend, and has us seeking truth. And all of this, there's the question then of centrality of framing processes. Who's determining our future? You know, when you think of this current election campaign, which is sort of shaping up to be one, you know, sort of one of a never-ending tedium in New Zealand, you know, why isn't it being framed in terms of values? It's being framed in terms of interest rates and you know, manufacturing and sustainable growth and so forth, but it's not being framed in terms of values. What is the kind of New Zealand we want to see realized? And how do we kind of make sure then that those of us committed to a non-violent future, personally, politically, and others, are part of this agenda setting for this year and beyond? Who are our principled non-violent leaders, and who are the people who are willing to kind of move in this direction with all of the stresses and strains that it will take? And how do we do transformation at a whole variety of levels? And if you just indulge me for a couple of minutes, I just want to talk about 2 or 3 different things. That when we're doing peace, we're doing it all from where we are and with what we've got. You can do it at elite levels, and you can do it at the mass movement levels. You can do it in groups of small decision makers and in large and diverse social movements. And we need to kind of figure out ways in which we connect to each of these different levels. For me, for example, going to the Quaker UN office in Geneva was a liberation, because it gave us an insight into how you could do politics differently. I'd spent a lot of my youth here, as many of you might know, sort of, organizing 1% Action for International Development, opposing the Security Intelligence Service Amendment Bill, the anti-apartheid cause, promoting civil liberties, mobilizing the masses behind these good causes, some of which we won, a lot of which we didn't win, but it was such a relief to be able to go to Geneva and invite sort of 6 people around a table for a lunch conversation about how to break an impasse on development issues, or how to get movement on chemical weapons, or whatever. A different way of doing politics, and a different way, if you attended carefully, to discovering where opportunity might lie. And then I've been doing work in problem-solving workshops, and these are available to all of us. How do we gather people from different groups and parties and hostilities together in spaces within which you can hold them for very awkward and challenging and difficult conversations. In America, we were involved in a thing called the Public Conversations Project, between the advocates of abortion and and those who wanted to protect life. To get them to see the other's perspective. And you can do this kind of problem solving at level of locality. But we did it in America, between the little secessionist state of Abkhazia and the state of Georgia, and bring together politicians and political leaders for problem-solving workshops to get them to focus on the deeper underlying sources of their problems, figuring out ways in which they could attend to each other. And this is challenging. How do you know you've got the right people, and if they've talked to each other, are they going to kind of go back home and transform them in transform their places in positive directions? That was a very sobering and salutary lesson for me. For example, I thought it would be very safe to bring the so-called Prosecutor General of Abkhazia together with a group of politicians from Georgia, and until I realized that this man, whose name was Andrei Jigenia, in case any of you meet up with him, was a big wheel in the Moscow Mafia, who had absolutely no desire to kind of get involved in solving the problem about autonomy and regionalism for Georgia. He simply wanted to create a space within which they could continue to produce counterfeit rubles out of Abkhazia and control the drug trade. So sometimes we make mistakes, but these are opportunities for building peace between peoples, for clarifying perceptions and misperceptions, and for thinking through ways in which you can kind of work on these things non-violently and creatively. And just recently I've been involved in programs in Northeast Asia, and I just sort of mentioned 2 of which have been workshops, bringing together Chinese, Japanese and Korean opinion leaders and academics and those who are close to policy formation, to try and get at some of the underlying sources of the problems that are confronting them. Problems that have to do with unresolved history. The Chinese and Koreans right now, you've got no idea how mad they are with Shinzo Abe's desire to revisit war history, to suggest that the comfort women was actually a very positive innovation on the part of the Japanese Imperial Army, because it meant that the Japanese troops didn't have to rape and pillage for sexual satisfaction. They were working with brothel owners from Korea and elsewhere, and it was all hunky-dory. He's trying to do this in the 21st century. He's even visiting the War Crimes Tribunal and saying half of the people that were classified as Class A war criminals should not be so classified, including his great-grandfather. And China and Japan, and then on Nanjing he says, well, there weren't 320,000 people killed there. Our best estimates are 95,000, as though somehow that absolves the massacre. So we get these North Koreans and Chinese and Japanese people together, and we say, well, where are these things coming from? How do you deal with these painful histories? Why haven't the apologies that have been made managed to work? And how do you prevent a deterioration of the relationship such that you could have some accidental military adventure that would result in in major conflicts. So quietly we bring these people together. We had a man from the Central Committee of the Communist Party, for example, who was very, very nervous at the beginning, and then at the end of 3 days of conversations, when he realized that the Japanese he was conversing with and the Koreans he was conversing with were all human beings and shared common aspirations and visions, he relaxed. But then, when all of the Sherpas from Korea, China and Japan tried to get a summit meeting together between all three countries on the 23rd of December last year, and it was scuppered by Shinzo Abe going to the Yakuzuni Shrine on the 24th of December last year, he pulled out of these conversations. But I'm just saying that I'm just using these illustrations of the way in which you utilize nonviolent principles with people who are in conflict by creating safe spaces for people who are in tension or in conflict to come together for awkward and difficult conversations about realizing an alternative future which may be more productive, more creative, and more nonviolent than the one they have. And we can do that in our schools, in our universities, in churches, and in political systems. The challenge is, how do we move beyond crippling and sort of stupid adversarialism to creative and constructive agonistic conversation? Agonistic conversation in the sense of putting anything on the table and being able to kind of create the spaces needed so that people can feel they can talk and reveal their deepest fears and their deepest concerns and have them attended to. And I probably can't go better than our dear old friend Thich Nhat Hanh, who said in a nice poem, he says, "Even as they strike you down with a mountain of hatred and violence, even as they dismember you and disembowel you, remember, brother, remember, man is not our enemy. The only thing worthy of you is compassion, invincible, limitless, unconditional. Hatred will never let you face the beast in man." That's it.